too much of that. I'd also argue that a metro mayor has actually united regions, cross-party, with academia, with local government, and indeed bringing community groups into that as well. And then finally, that actually a metro mayor has been a sort of uniting point for the political arrangements in the area as well. And I'm sure there's no coincidence in the advance of conservatism across the West Midlands where we've got that sort of united force. But within that, I'd also argue that genuine localism, community influence has been really strong. Just a couple of examples of where we've given decision-making rights to local communities over how we spend our money, for example, in cycle upgrades, how we spend our money that actually comes from the National Lottery Community Fund on our community celebrations that we call the Mayor's Community Weekend. And then away from the money, influencing policy decisions. Just recently, bringing the Extinction Rebellion crew, there's a community group if ever there was one, into our decisions on climate change, using citizens' panels to decide on our mental health policies, and of course also in our approach to disability and sport. And then the last way in which we've really involved communities has been in our approach to faith organisations. Huge in a diverse region like the West Midlands. The fact that we're working with faith organisations, for example, to plan our approach to hate crime, and indeed just last week we were with the churches across the Black Country thinking about their approach to some of the biggest social issues like homelessness. So genuinely our community groups are involved. So in conclusion, the devolution agenda is not stopped. We're not at the end of the journey. Indeed, yesterday it was brilliant to hear Sajid talk about a devolution white paper. But I'm absolutely sure the journey is well underway. The next things we need are some sort of single pot arrangement where the government gives us large sums of money for us to then allocate rather than have our homework marked in London, as I always say, or indeed us retain some local taxation to give real authority to our places, just as American or French or German cities have. But the thing I want you to think about is every single decision in that structure is taken at the appropriate level. As I say, central government doing what it should do, regional government, if you think about economic planning, that has to be done on the region, local authorities still providing their services, and then community associations, for example, doing what they're doing. And the last thought is, of course, that it's our party, a decentralising party, that has given responsibility back to the regions and communities. And the general tendency of the Labour Party is, of course, to centralise, to over-control, to disempower. That is one of the clear distinctions that is emerging in these two conference weeks. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. No, thank you very much. That was a wonderful segue, actually, Andy. We hadn't pre-scripted what you were going to say or what I was going to say. It's a wonderful segue into what I wanted to talk about, because metro mayors are still, even just in the 2 short years that they've existed, quite a new invention, certainly in UK politics. And I think it's always worth setting out what we actually do. We are not central government, clearly, based in the regions. We're also not local authorities, and I don't envy any of our local authorities over some of the services that they have to provide, potholes, waste disposal, and all those other things that really are where politics and the rubber meets the tarmac. I always try and do the elevator pitch, which we are really there for economic growth and job creation. And those types of things, if they fit into adding value to those two things, then that is generally where we have overview on a regional level. And I think the government have recognised that under George Osborne and David Cameron with the devolution agenda, recognising that actually local people understand their local areas far better, not just politicians in Westminster, but also the civil service. For example, in my area in Teesside, very few have ever been to the area and understand what it's actually all about. So having leadership based in the region, and importantly with powers, which we have as metro mayors, and we're on that devolution journey where more powers will be coming along the line, especially under this government now that Boris has reignited the devolution agenda, but also with money. And you can't have one without the other. You can't have the responsibility without the means with which to affect change, and you can't have the money without the power to be able to affect that change. And I think in the 2 short years that we've been in post, localism is paying dividends. In my area, we've been able to take back control of our local airport, something that would never have been able to be done by a local authority, and nothing that central government would ever have dreamed of thinking about. But actually on a local level, many people in this room would think that a strange proposition to do, but actually on a local level it was the right thing to do. And in supporting our local economy, and because we understand not just the priorities in our local economy around logistics, processing and chemicals, manufacturing, and the ability to connect internationally from a local area, it makes sense to bring that infrastructure together. And I think one of the additional things that localism will no doubt play a part in the future, albeit I think in this short time that we've existed, it is yet to really take control, is over the education agenda. And I think one of the things, if you have the levers over the economic powers, if you have levers with the money to implement that economic change, my pitch is always, if I'm creating jobs in Redcar by the coast in my region, people in Darlington on the other side of my region need to be able to access those jobs that are being created and vice versa. And not everybody can afford a car, and we need good public transport. It needs to be better connected. And we also need to make sure that those people, while being able to connect to those jobs, are qualified in them. Because it's one thing getting people qualified, but if our regional economy demands a different skill set to the one that is being provided by our local education establishments, we need a much more joined-up approach. And that can't be done through the centralisation at Westminster. It needs to be done in the local area. And I'll just leave you with two great examples of where local leadership can take a real lead on this. And given the Brexit debate, everything else gets completely overshadowed by it. But only last week, a huge amount of work because of our priorities in the region around engineering, manufacturing and offshore wind, and the government's priority to move towards renewables and a net zero target in 2050, many of you, although some of you will have heard this, but many of you won't have heard the amazing result of the CFD auction for offshore wind that was only announced last week. And the North East is seeing projects like Dogger Bank, which will be the world's largest wind farm built 80 miles off the northeast coast, which will see the northeast be the world lead and continue to be the world lead in offshore wind. That's all been able to be catalysed through local leadership, understanding local supply chains, and feeding that information into the partnership in central government to make sure that regional businesses and supply chains are supported. And it's a great example of where working together, the UK now is on an international platform and is putting forward a brand new industry where it will play a key role in the long-term future. So on that point, I'll stop.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. So what does localism mean for local government? It's absolutely at the heart of everything that we do. I would argue that the decision-making role of being at the right place has changed, fundamentally changed. I've been elected now for about 18 years, and the local authority that I joined provided services to which people attached themselves and joined. They didn't necessarily get a say in those services, nor did they have the ability to shape those services so that they were in fact something that was going to enhance their life or enable them to live their lives better. I think we've changed. I think the necessity of changing is absolutely something we must do all the time. I think that what we're now doing is co-producing. We are talking to our communities, we're talking to individuals, and we're trying to shape the sort of services that will make people's lives better. The only reason I get out of bed in the morning, and the people who work in my authority and across the country, is to help people to lead their lives, to help us to shape the communities that our generations growing through are going to want, to get the jobs that you've talked about, Ben and Andy, to shape the business sector, to give them the ability to help drive forward and be strong and dynamic in that area. And every part that we play is about trying to take the cradle to grave agenda. So the schools, giving the opportunities to our young people. They have a child's life for 5 years. They cannot repeat that 5 years. They have to be excellent. And it is our role in local government to drive standards and to drive that opportunity and to give them those abilities to lift their sights and have aspiration. But for me, it's about what are we doing? Are we shaping or are we following the demand of society? And I think it's a really interesting thing over the last few years where we know we have a growing aging population, which is a great thing. We also know that we've got a really growing population of people with long-term disabilities that local government have to support. How do we make those lives really fulfilled and the best opportunity that everyone can? I think that we need to lead that. It's around offering the best housing that we can, the chances to get into employment, and the ability to meet their needs to afford the life that they can. I think local government is really well placed in shaping and drawing up that society. We see that a lot now with local plans being delivered and trying to form the houses along networks of infrastructure. And I think it's been a tough time for local government over the last 10 years when funding has been really tight. I think it has invented new ways of working and new ways of doing it. What I do think is that local government has also devolved powers down. So arguably, we do everything in partnership now. We work with our business sector, we work with our universities, our school sector, but one of the most important partners in our lives is actually the voluntary sector. And the voluntary sector is not just the obvious ones, they are the towns and the parish councils who know their community and who shape their community. And I believe that not only should we be devolved down to from central government, but we too should devolve down those decisions to those communities who really understand the needs of their place. So I put that as a proposition. We need to let go just as much.
Thank you, Izzy.
Morning, everyone. So I'm the odd one out on the panel. I'm the non-politician here as the chief executive of Barnardo's, the country's leading children's charity. I'm delighted to bring that voice from the voluntary sector, the independent voice, to this debate around forging stronger communities, because it's such a critical part of the journey. I would go further, actually, and say that the voluntary sector, with its very long and rich history in this country over centuries, has played a critical part to binding communities together. And that's what we currently do as well. And that's even more significant and important in the most difficult times when communities are challenged in all sorts of ways. And here we are after a decade of austerity, and we all know the impact that has had, and we hope and pray that we're about to come out of it. Time will tell. But in that period, the most vulnerable have suffered the most. That's what usually happens in difficult times. And that's when the voluntary sector, in partnership with a whole range of other people, in the way that Izzy was describing, stands up and provides the support, the glue, that might just give people hope through those really difficult times. And I'm talking about, the health sector, the housing challenges, the mental health crisis that we're facing in this country, the challenges that schools have in providing wraparound services beyond straightforward education. I say that as a former teacher, myself really understanding that world well. The services for older people and so on. And the voluntary sector plays a part addressing all of those challenges. But it's getting more and more difficult, and more of the same isn't going to suffice. So the partnership working that Izzy was just talking about, thinking outside the box, the co-production of what the solution is the only way to be. I think we've all got to move away from any of the individual services, whether they're run by mayors or by local council leaders, or the private sector that dabbles in and out of providing services. Anybody thinking that they can solve the challenges that communities, the people that we exist to serve, face is mistaken. The only way is to develop an interdependence where we each understand how each other's shoes pinch, where we all let go of our individual silos, our boundaries that separate us, work together in an integrated way where we co-produce the solutions. And that could be a joint production of a range of providers from public, private, and voluntary sector coming together, right at the core of that being the recognition that none of us can do this alone. And actually, our communities, the hundreds of thousands of young people that Barnardo supports every day, they don't really care about who's providing the support, but they want to know that it's going to be available when they need it, it's going to be of the quality that they need it, and it's going to be sustained for as long as they need it. And the voluntary sector is absolutely critical to that. The final message I'd give to everybody out there from local government is that don't think about the voluntary sector as an afterthought. Unfortunately, that's still happening far too often. Invite us in right at the start of when you're trying to identify the challenge that you're trying to solve. Involve us in trying to develop the solution, and then let's jointly deliver it?
Well, thank you, everybody. Before I come on to the questions on this very nifty app, Conservative Party conference app, that some of you I see are using, I just want to ask a quick question myself. I mean, I, at Policy Exchange, have done quite a lot of work on issues of integration and segregation of communities, and this is, in some parts of the country, a big issue. So my question is probably particularly an issue in many of our big metropolitan centres like Birmingham, and particularly the whole issue of school segregation, when having sort of mono-ethnic schools. And I just wonder, you know, whether, well, you, Andy, particularly, but anybody on the panel has any sort of ideas about what we do about that, and you know, whether it just has to be accepted as a fact of life.
So, in a perfect world, every school would be completely representative of the wider community that it serves. That, I'm afraid, is not going to happen. So I think some of our best schools actually do reflect that, and if you look at the results of some of our best schools, that's the case. But also, to be entirely fair, some of our schools where there is pretty much monoculture also perform incredibly well. So, and we do have this constantly as a challenge in Birmingham, and if we're very honest, we go back to the Trojan horse scandal of a few years ago, that was where this went wrong. So my answer to it is very clear. The school will naturally, because it serves a population, end up being pretty much dominated by one culture. But it has to operate within the guidance of what is the national curriculum, and all of the standards around British values and democracy and all of that have to be taught. And I have seen brilliant schools in the West Midlands where they are not as mixed as maybe we would like, where they actually deliver brilliant results and turn out brilliant citizens. But it is ensuring that that guidance is adhered to. And where we went wrong was when that guidance was not adhered to.
Anybody else want to comment on that? On this one?
Yeah, I'd go a bit further, actually, and just reframe the question. Because if we know that we've got communities and we've got schools and areas in the country that are not multicultural, you know, they are monocultural, as you say, and thriving. But the question is, why is it? Why has it happened over these years, over the decades? Why have people felt that they need to congregate alongside in where they choose to live and where they choose to study with people who are similar to them? And it could be race, faith, culture, all kinds of different issues. And what is it about our society that makes it difficult for some people to feel confident about integration? And the challenge that I would put, and I say this as a former Brummie myself, went to inner city comprehensive in the heartlands of inner city Birmingham. In fact, one of the schools that since has been, you know, dare I say, Trojan horsed. That's where I grew up, and it was monocultural. And what I saw through that upbringing of inner city Birmingham, and I see it in other parts of the country, and the young people that Bernardo's works with day in, day out, we hear this all the time, that people feel that they need greater support to feel confident as they're growing up in this fantastic country of ours. And not enough people are focused on them as individuals. Not enough people are focused on giving them the confidence to be who they are and display their difference, as opposed to a pressure to assimilate. And it's really quite complicated for young people to navigate that difficult terrain. Many of their parents and their grandparents are from grew up in a different time and place, from a different part of the country. And so all of that dynamic has to be understood to understand why people choose to congregate in particular ways. And I mean, let's not forget, you know, expats from Britain who have congregated in other parts of the world have chosen to actually create their mini Englands in other parts. You know, just go to the Costa del Sol and parts of Spain, you know, it is mini Britain out there. So it's not unusual for people to congregate amongst who they feel comfortable with.
Well, exactly. I mean, that is the point. I mean, that you might say it's even human nature for people to congregate together with people who they have a lot in common with, who they have cultural traditions in common with. But the point is, you know, a good society is also one in which you have people moving across these boundaries of social class or ethnicity or whatever. And so how you get that balance, and clearly, you know, many people think that we haven't been getting the balance right in many parts of the country. And I think it's sort of, you know, I mean, I don't see where this assimilationist pressure is coming from. If anything, surely it's the opposite. People are constantly being told to celebrate their diversity. I see no, if anything, I see insufficient pressure for integration. But one policy idea that is sometimes talked about is the idea that local authorities of various kinds should publish data. You know, every 2 or 3 years, people should have to publish data on how mixed their neighbourhoods are, how mixed their schools are. And that would be a great pressure. You know, nobody wants to be the most segregated local authority in the country. That would act as a kind of pressure on people. I mean, possibly an unfair one on certain councils, but
I kind of get that. I do understand that challenge and that pressure, but actually it's people and parents who make choices about what's most convenient for them. In my particular authority, we're pretty big geographical spread, and actually they're going to end up going to the school that's closest to them. Our budgets are challenged by affording to support people to get to their nearest school, and we can't necessarily support outside of that. And I think everyone is in the same boat in local authority. We've ended up with just a few elements of education in our own local authorities, and that's around admissions, transport and special needs. There is little choice for us in how we assimilate that. But I do believe in individual people making choices. What I also believe in is people respecting and valuing the broad society that we are, and the richness that can help.
Right. Quick one, Ben, and then we need to go to
I
the
take
questions.
a slightly different slant on this in a way from my view, especially being a mayor in the northeast of England, that you're only as well off as your least well off member of your community. And we have a large Pakistani community in Middlesbrough, but actually my region is pretty monocultural. We actually have a greater issue about integration of socioeconomic backgrounds. Actually, some people may have seen a documentary that was on, I think, Panorama, that showed that my area, within a 15-mile distance, has the largest disparity of economic wealth than anywhere else in the country. We've got huge swathes of very wealthy, very well-off communities, but we have some of the most deprived in the country. And you then get the ghettoization of socioeconomic areas where schools go into a terminal decline because there is that lack of integration. There's also a lack of thinking about how you tackle that type of segregation separate to those that have already been discussed.
Yeah, I think our regional income disparities in this country are twice those of France, which is something to consider. Anyway, time to come to the app and to your questions. The first one that has the highest number of votes, so I'm going to be scrupulously fair about this, is also a very simple one. And actually I might add an addendum to it. How can councils support our local high streets? And I want to add, how can councils support our local media to help create and support local identities? Who wants to go on that? High streets and media.
I'll make a start on that. The high streets have changed. The way we shop these days has changed. You know, we have our facilities in our hands, and certainly my daughter, my son, you know, they buy online. We're not going to stop that. What we have to do is make our high streets live. And I would say that that's going to be about the experience, the offer that the society can be provided. It might be about eating, it might be about a greater offer for mums with children and how can they entertain them and give them opportunities. They are going to look different, and we have always evolved, and that is the nature of our society. What we're not going to do is be able to stop the technological revolution and the way people are shopping. So propping up shops is going to be a difficulty. I think there really is something we should do, which is around business rates, which ought to be addressed, because there is a huge differential between those who are providing online services and those who are out there paying business rates on shops in the high street. And I think we have to change that.
It's an interesting devolution argument, actually. One of the conversations we're having is not just high streets, but how do we support local businesses? What control can we effect locally? And one of those is around taxation. And invariably, when you speak to Treasury officials in particular, They want to give us precepts and levies on business rates and transport levies and council tax levies. But as soon as you approach the subject of, well, if we can put 3% on local council tax, does that also come with the power to reduce it by 3%? And the answer there comes none. So actually, we have limited number of roles that we can play locally because it's largely around taxation policy and business rates of our high streets. The one thing I would warn against local councils in particular trying to preserve what the high streets of yesteryear used to be, because we're never going to get back there because of change of consumer behaviour. Consumers want something different. Just very, very quickly on the media aspect, it's interesting. I do think local leaders, council leaders and metro mayors can play a huge role in helping to solidify local identity. And I think that's one of the key reasons why when George Osborne introduced the metro mayor system, it was with a requirement to have a directly elected mayor, because there was a focal point and a figurehead that a community in a region could coalesce around. And I always thought it would work to some extent, but I've been pleasantly surprised to the extent with which people do look to that person to be the voice and community voice for that region. And a great example of that in very tragic circumstances was Andy Burnham after the bombings in Manchester. Within, I think, 2 or 3 weeks after being elected, was seen as that voice of Manchester and the greater area. And he did an amazing job in bringing the community together, something that wouldn't have been there had that position not been created.
Andy?
So to the question, the answer's lots, frankly. I mean, we all know high streets are changing, and there is an enormous role for councils to, as Ben said, not try to resist that change, but frankly enable us to get to a new good place. So just a few ideas, and we're trying to work through these in our West Midlands High Streets Task Force around this. So first of all, using the CPO powers that local authorities have to deal with derelict buildings, possibly turning them into homes. The explosion of residential living in city centres has been enormous, but middle-sized towns, we've not tended to get to it, so an enormous opportunity there. Then there's a question of what can be done maybe about start-up business incubators, using derelict shops for that. We've seen some brilliant examples of that. Local authorities can hasten that. Then there's the whole question about what they do about parking charges, needs to be minimised. We've seen 2 great councils in the West Midlands, Dudley and Walsall, all but eliminate car parking charges in town centres. Makes a real difference. And then there's all the stuff about public realm, and of course councils can also foster lots of activities like markets, street fairs, whatever, to bring a sense of occasion to town centres. So actually there's an enormous role that the local authority can play to enable private sector development then to come and rejuvenate our towns. On the media question, interesting, because, you know, we think of media as printed media, but I think that is something of yesteryear. And what we're definitely seeing, again, nationwide, but I've got lots of examples from the West Midlands, is where new community media organisations are setting up, maybe really influential bloggers, and they're almost like the diarist of what's going on in town centres and can drive activity in. So enormous role for genuinely local media to cherish our town centres.
Yeah, the high street really matters to Bernardo's as well. People may not know we're one of the largest retailers on the high street. We have over 710 Bernardo's stores across the country. And so this whole issue really matters to us as well. You know, the decline of the high street and footfall is dropping and so on. And what I'd like to see from council leaders is to think much more multi-agency in terms of what we do with our spaces. So in Bernardo's, for example, we'd like the retail store that we're running, you know, trying to provide cheaper retail clothing for local residents, but to make it multifunctional. So, you know, if you're looking for a new place for a smaller version of a library or a community place for people to meet or an advice centre, let's bring these services together alongside the traditional retail outlets.
What about subsidising pubs that are going out of business? I mean, I think, you know, several hundred close every week, I've read somewhere. I mean, and they're often really important, particularly perhaps for older people, they're really important centres of community. I mean, is that too unconservative a thing to do, to subsidise the continuing existence of a pub? Anyone have any views on that?
A one-word answer? Yes. I mean, the general point here is you can't buck the market. No. And that, I mean, let's be honest, some pubs are going out of business, but they're also incredibly successful community-based pubs, real ale pubs. Wetherspoons is an incredible regeneration.
They tend to be for younger people, though, don't they? I mean,
not necessarily, but the principle stands. The local authority should not be subsidising individual businesses.
And my belief around that, I completely agree with Andy, and it is not for local authorities to subsidise businesses. You know, per se, because where do you stop and where do you start? And there is a reason why businesses by pubs are probably failing because the footfall stops. And it's a little bit like, you know, buses in rural areas. Unless you get people using these buses and using the transport facilities, we will not be able to keep them going. It is choice.
Okay, let me move on to another question. Okay, so what more can local leaders do to attract big businesses out of London to their areas?
Do you want me to start?
Well, why not?
So, again, the answer is a huge amount. I maybe will tell a story which I think will help in this, because probably one of the most high-profile relocations recently has been HSBC moving their retail bank headquarters from Canary Wharf to Birmingham. Now, who'd have thought a bank would move its headquarters from Canary Wharf? And it's fascinating to understand why they chose to come and then what they have discovered. It was not because we gave a subsidy on the rent or anything like that. It was actually for 3 reasons. The first was they believed that they could get the workforce that they needed. And of course, this is a head office workforce, well-paid jobs. Can a regional city offer what London provides? And they will say categorically that we did. So the critical thing is the skills development to enable you to attract these outstanding business. The second thing was all about the things that the workforce would enjoy. So it was about schools, green spaces, great cultural attractions, and that human story was actually more important than almost anything else. And the third thing was connectivity to markets. Now, I know that's a lot easier if you're in Birmingham than some other places, but that's, again, what HSBC was really after. Can our customers interact with us either virtually or obviously physically? So it was about those things which you work on in your economic plans rather than a particular deal for the subsidy for a relocation.
I think as well, it is also what we find in our area, it's also about those specific projects, because as Andy alluded to in his opening remarks, if people want to invest in the northeast of England, who do they speak to? And they're looking for that leader and that person to be able to pick up the phone to sit across the table with and say, is there a deal to be done? Can we have a conversation about access to labour, land costs? Can we have a conversation about transport links? And especially to international investment, which is a large part of what we have as a branch economy in the northeast, big investors from North America and the Far East, they are used to going somewhere, acting business to business, in effect CEO to CEO, to try and do a deal. And they need to know that they have the political buy-in before they move to those next phases. And let's be honest, Teesside wasn't on the map for large parts of this until there was a directly elected mayor that they felt like they could go and have that conversation with. And we're seeing, as I alluded to in my opening remarks, the work we've done with Equinor and SSE around making sure that we did all we could to support them around the CFD auction, which has resulted in now a Dogger Bank, a £9 billion project where manufacturing in the northeast is going to play the central role in offshore wind. That wouldn't happen unless you're able to interact on an effective senior management level to make sure that you soften and finesse the way into central government. Central government can often be quite harsh the way that it deals with individual businesses.
Most of those companies are foreign owned. And is that an issue or not? Most of the wind power companies are they're owned by the Dutch and the Danes and people, aren't they?
So it also depends on which part. So you've got the licenses for the sites themselves, which are largely dominated in this CFD round, like the likes of SSE and Equinor. You then have the tier 1 suppliers, which are who are manufacturing the things. And the government have a great Stexter deal around 60% UK content for offshore wind. I think it's a great industrial strategy proposition, but they've achieved it by accident, because one of the things with offshore wind is that part of the CFD auction was that 60% UK content, and if you don't have that, you get penalised in the auction. However, if everybody is supplying it from abroad and everybody gets penalised, then nobody's penalised. And actually, that's where we've been able to work very effectively with BEIS and DIT to show that there is a proposition in the northeast, a large area where manufacturing can occur. And we're now speaking to all of the largest offshore wind manufacturers who are now aware of us, working effectively with DIT and central government, who point them in our direction, because there is a more joined-up approach. And that's not just directly with the companies, it's also educating government departments about the propositions in the regions that they wouldn't have otherwise known about had these types of organisations not existed. And I mean, I'm sure there are councils doing some fantastic things, but it's often because of the financial situation councils are under at the moment, they don't necessarily have the resource and the ability to spend that time being as outward-facing and as focused as we can, because our focus is much more narrow than a normal council.
Let me just go to another very simple, straightforward question. Should more transport policy be devolved to the regions?
Well, Andy definitely would say yes.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, do you want?
I think we'd all say yes.
Yeah, we all would. Yes.
I suppose, yeah, that's a
Very
simple
simple.
one. Okay, well, I can't resist this one. This is a rather self-interested one because it uses a couple of terms that I invented. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Road to Somewhere, in which I talked about the value divides in our society that had led to Brexit and Trump and populism and so on. I talked about the people who see the world from anywhere and the people who see the world from somewhere, the anywheres being generally highly educated, mobile, liberally minded people, the somewheres being much more rooted, less well educated, people who care about security and familiarity. So there are 5 votes for this question. I'm not just pushing it up the list. But somebody has asked, is the Conservative Party switching from being the party of anywheres to being the party of somewheres?
I think it is. And I think it's largely in very recent times because of Boris. You know, Boris having been, as you alluded to in your opening remarks, that he was a mayor of somewhere and an area that required practical solutions rather than necessary abstract solutions. Actually understanding what local communities need and how you can affect change in a specific area. We've seen it with policies on bus devolution, conversations on regional train devolution and rail devolution. Right. And actually the very frank conversation that the Prime Minister had with myself and the other northern mayors was that you know, it's great that you're able to do things with these powers and this money, but you need more responsibility because, and that comes with additional powers. And I think looking outside of our major cities, one of the things that massively frustrates me, and it has done ever since I got this fortunate enough to get this job, is that when people look to the north of England, there's a lazy stereotype that they just go to Manchester. And the north of England is so much more than Manchester. It's so much more than our northern city. It's the great towns of Blackburn, Blackpool, Middlesbrough, Gateshead. I mean, it's all of those places. And actually, I think you will see over the coming weeks the Conservative Party focus much, much more on our towns rather than the metropolitan cities, which is often the focus of political policy.
Although, of course, Boris did also come to Manchester, I think his second day as Prime Minister, was it? And he said in that speech, you know, I recognise the Brexit vote was as much a vote against London as it was against Brussels.
It absolutely was.
And for me, absolutely, of course, it's about the somewhere. It's about why can I not make my place the best place for people to live, work, and to grow their family? And you know, life is a competition. Life is about being the best about it, offering that to your population and to your citizen, that sense of invested pride in the area that they live, and they're wanting to support their networks that help them to create that. I think it's really important because that's actually what we're about in Britain.
So I really hope the answer is yes. The Conservative Party is for somewheres. I mean, I think, you know, we've heard lots of statements and promises about how the future is going to be different. Fundamentally, I think any political party in this country that doesn't recognize the danger of creating postcode lotteries for public service is in danger of losing its connection with what the public want. It shouldn't matter where you live. There should be a minimum standard, a universal service offer, particularly for the most vulnerable who rely on the state. Beyond that, you can have local flex, you know, the mayors and the council leaders and so on can put their local flavor depending on their populations and their particular needs, but the minimum standard should be available everywhere. It shouldn't be based on this lottery of where you happen to be born.
Right, yeah. Although, of course, one of the you know, we talk a lot about social mobility, and one of the sort of problems with our social geography in this country is that, you know, every year, all the brightest 18-year-olds from many of the most depressed parts of the country leave, you know, Mansfield or Rotherham, and go to a residential university and never come home, or at least never come home permanently. So, you know, the stress on social mobility via higher education is exacerbating, you might say, the social divisions in our country.
And I think that it is fundamentally about how you shape the offer in your community, how you build the skills, and what that skills offer is going to be to the business sector that, you know, arguably the mayors. I personally, you know, we've got two mayors sitting here, but I believe that we can still do that in the rurality areas where I I believe that we have to drive for economy and for growth, and that has to be based on skills and what the offer is in that area.
Let's go, because we've got to wind up, I think, in a couple of minutes. So let me go to a final question, which is a nice big general one again, but perhaps brings us back to decision-making systems, and it is this. How can we strengthen localism and local decision-making post-Brexit? 2 minutes from each of you.
Do you want me to go first?
Well, no, you can go last, Andy,
right.
actually. Well, let's do it in reverse order.
So I think one of the big weaknesses of the localism agenda so far has been not enough focus on what young people want. We've got to find really creative ways of engaging with their voice, and young people want that voice, are demanding it. They're not all going to be Greta Thunbergs, of course, really national movements, but there are local people, and Bernardo's works with them all the time. There is a trust deficit at the moment. We recently did a survey of young people where 67% of those young people said that they had no confidence in the future. 62% said that the government doesn't care enough about them and cares about older people. Right? A lot of them don't have a vote, of course, but today's young people are the ones going to be traveling on tomorrow's transport systems. Today's young people are going to have very different lifestyles to the ones we've had, different work patterns and so on. So as we develop policy, national or local, let's focus on the young people's voice too, please.
I think we need to celebrate leaders. We really need to build leadership in wider areas possible. It's so important because it's leadership and it's partnership that will help to shape our places in the future. We in local authorities deal with every sector of society, from children to working age to our retired. It's absolutely essential that we listen to them, help shape those communities, and build a sense of pride and a sense of purpose in our communities. And that comes from leadership.
I'm going to concentrate on what I think is a fairly boring point, actually, and it's the strength of the organisations as they exist. A great example, Boris wants to level up all the powers to all the regional mayors, for instance. However, you know, if one of the things that isn't being devolved at the moment is health, I wouldn't want to touch health, because if government decided to give me health tomorrow, the whole system would fall over because of the lack of maturity of the organisation. So what this is a journey, and it's about earned autonomy. It's about the organisation showing that it's growing, it's mature enough to take on more responsibility, and that's where you've got to work more with central government and local partners to show and prove that actually you can take that responsibility. Because if it all goes wrong, because government all of a sudden say, right, just take all the decisions locally, it's an easy thing to say, but when it falls over in 2 weeks' time, it's the government's going to get the backlash. So it's a balance of speed and when you deliver it rather than if you just deliver it.
Final word, Andy.
Okay, final word. So I'm going to answer your question in a sense by going back to the anywhere and somewhere, because you didn't give me an opportunity to answer that. So, and I'm going to say something slightly different to my colleagues, because the answer is it's got to be both on those things. And in a sense, the post-Brexit opportunity has got to enable us to do that. So, of course, there's got to be a move to the somewhere, and that is actually what Theresa May's government also realised after 2016. If you think of the banners around our conferences, it was all about an economy that works for everywhere, every place, and that's indeed why devolution has been set up and why we're sitting here. But what we mustn't lose is Britain's leadership on the anywhere piece as well, because we mustn't underestimate how substantial and wonderful that has made this country in the eyes of the rest of the world. And a flip from one to the other would be entirely wrong. Now then, so what then has to happen in terms of practical things post-Brexit? There's all the stuff about continuing devolution, where the cash flow goes, but I want to put one other thing on the table as well. We've actually got to think about how our politics as well, you said it was a vote against London, it was also a vote against our political structures. So one thing I am very, very keen to see is we have a much more, and you might say this is fanciful, but we're trying to do it on the ground, a much more inclusive approach to politics. So it's definitely bringing the business community in, it's definitely bringing the academic community in, it's trying to find consensus rather than constantly finding the divisions in society. And it's also, as others have said, trying to do this in partnership, and there is absolutely, as both as Izzy said particularly, this whole notion of bringing youth, community groups in together. And that's the challenge for the politicians, to change the framework from one of adversarial work to one of collaborative work.
Well, thank you, Andy. And, well, thank you. I mean, local government can be a pretty dry subject, but I think we've managed to inject a bit of interest in it in the last 45 minutes. all of life was there. So can you say thank you in the usual way to our panel? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lord Michael Dodds, who'll be in conversation with Ian Dale.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. At the moment, it's just me, not Michael Dodds, but he will be here in a second. And what we're going to do over the course of the next 35 minutes or so is Michael was going to make a short speech, then I'm going to be in conversation with him, and then we'll take some questions from you. But if you can submit the questions via the Conservative Party app, which I'm sure you've all got on your phones, and if you are looking at your phones doing this, I won't think that you're bored, I'll just think that you're asking questions. He's a fascinating character. As you know, he was the creator of House of Cards, but he's got a real history in the Conservative Party. He was Chief of Staff to Norman Tebbit in the late 1980s, and then left politics to start writing novels. And what a successful career he's had. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Dodds. Oh, there he is. Yeah. The late Michael Dodds.
Yes.
Good to see you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Manchester. It's great to be here with you. But they've asked me to talk about politics and writing. Political fiction, you know. It's the easy stuff. You just take reality and then you water it down. You have to make it credible. But then, at times, it's not that easy. A little while ago, I was in a bookshop in Bournemouth, and a little old lady rushed over to me and said, I've always wanted to meet you and tell you that I read 1 or 2 pages of your book before I fall fast asleep at night. I hope I have a little bit more luck with you. Many years ago, so many years ago that I must have been young, I worked for a lady called Margaret Thatcher. You may remember her. She was the woman that President Chirac described as having the lips of Marilyn Monroe and the eyes of Caligula. So I guess it was always going to be a bit of a bumpy ride. I was her chief of staff. Now, Norman Tebbit told me what that meant. He said that there comes a time in every war when those in charge require that someone be taken out into a courtyard, be put up against a wall, and shot. My job was to find the body until the time came when I would be that body. Well, Maggie and me, we had more than 10 extraordinary years as I worked for her. I was the first person on election night in 1979 to be able to turn to her and tell her, "Congratulations, you're Prime Minister." "We shall see," she said, "we shall see." And by goodness, we did. But We fell out in the end, Maggie and me. I got a right old handbagging. It happens. But that doesn't stop me from regarding her as being the greatest peacetime Prime Minister that this country had during the 20th century. We had a falling out, so what? Well, so what? I went off to a little Mediterranean island of Gozo to recuperate, and I decided it was time to look for another job. Or Maggie rather insisted. So one morning I sat down beside the swimming pool with a pad and a pen and a bottle of wine to see if I could write. And by the time I had finished that bottle of wine, I had scribbled on my writing pad just 2 initials. F.U. Now, clearly I should have been in therapy. But as the holiday went on, F.U. became a chap called Francis Urquhart. And F.U. became his character. And the book was called House of Cards. John Major was kind enough to say that it had done for his job what Dracula had done for babysitting. And the book transformed my life. And I owe it all to being beaten up by Maggie. Then we made an American version with President Frank Underwood. I called him FU too. And it all became rather popular. Italy's Prime Minister Renzi was photographed going into a bookshop and purchasing a copy. So I thought I should write to him. Sir, I said, I hope that you will enjoy my book, but please remember that it's a work of entertainment, not a work of instruction. And a few years ago, President Xi of China came to Britain on a state visit, and I was invited to meet him. Now, House of Cards has millions of followers in China. I think they see it as a documentary. So I decided to present him with an original hardback copy of the book, now more than 30 years old. When I gave the book to him, his eyes lit up in gratitude. Then he saw what it was, and he frowned. "What?" he said. "You have House of Cards in this country too?" Well, I'm very happy to say that House of Cards is a huge hit in China. So is Mr. Bean and Downton Abbey and many other wonderful British ideas. And just think about what that means. At the touch of a button, we can send our message, our culture, our values, our stories, our brands around the globe. The world is shrinking. It's getting smaller. We have the ability today to share our values, our ideas, our goods and services in a way we simply couldn't have imagined 20 years ago. That's a hugely exciting prospect for global Britain. What isn't shrinking, growing smaller, of course, is the row about political language. This one is about as balmy as you can get. Now, as a writer, you hopefully develop some feel for language and a sense of the meaning of words. But it doesn't really require much sense at all to know that the accusations that Boris is inciting violence are really, really silly. It's not the Conservative Party hanging effigies from the bridges. Now, the object of this particular exercise is very clear. It's to beat up on Boris and hope that he will buckle. In just the same way as so many attending our conferences these past years have been spat at, sworn at, shouted down, and politically intimidated. Try being a Tory on a university campus and you'll soon see what I mean. But they have made a terrible mistake because Boris and we are made of sterner stuff. And I tell you something, when it comes to insults, I cannot think of anything more insulting than to call 17.4 million people stupid, ignorant, ill-informed, bigots, racist. How dare they? Mind you, these are the same people who are threatening to abolish private schools just as soon as their children have finished their education. You couldn't make this stuff up. Being a classic liberal used to be about fair play, about rights and responsibilities, about balancing freedoms. It was a badge of pride. Sadly, being a liberal today has become an excuse for little but arrogance and intolerance. I was reading about Winston Churchill over the summer. It's something that Boris and I have in common. We've both written books about Churchill, although I should modestly admit that I've written rather more than he has. 4 novels, a television play, and I hope more to come. But Boris, he's a young man, filled with ambition. I'm sure he'll catch up eventually. But my reading reminded me of so many similarities between then and now. For instance, how bitterly they opposed Winston in the 1930s. The establishment, I mean. During those crucial years, the establishment got almost everything that was important wrong. Horribly wrong. Promised peace with honor. Peace in our time. Embraced appeasement. Claimed it was the moral option. And accused Winston of being a warmonger. Yes, of inciting violence. Any of this sound familiar? They accused him of inappropriate language. Winston Churchill, at one stage, he was even howled into silence in the House of Commons. They refused to listen to him. But fortunately, Winston found a way forward. He trusted the people, not the establishment, but the common sense of the people. In his first speech as Prime Minister, while many in the establishment expected and some even wanted him to fail, he said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." Brutal honesty. He trusted the people with the truth. That's why he overcame and why we won. And if it was good enough for Winston, well, food for thought, perhaps, for today. But you know, politics isn't just about policies. Politics is about dreams, just as writing so often is. But sometimes I worry. What dreams do the young have? And not enough, I would suggest. And perhaps that's not so surprising. Think about it. If you're 25, you are the future. You're the country's future. You are our future. But what sort of past have you been given? Your first political memory was probably the bombing of the Twin Towers. After that, years of war upon war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria. And if that wasn't enough, we then threw the mother and father of financial crises at you. Now, I could, of course, blame so much of that on the liberal establishment, but that's not the point I want to make here. It's that in looking beyond Brexit, we must find ways of raising their sights and refocusing their energies, restore their hope, give them the opportunity to climb the mountain, to take those risks, and to see the glorious view from the summit. Because Brexit is all about tomorrow. That's why I get so excited about what lies ahead. I'm an optimist. I have to be. I've got 4 kids. That's why I've had to write so many books. And I'm an optimist because I have faith in our people and our country. Brexiteers are optimists. We are also realists, and we are winners. I want to end this talk before I get to the wonderful Ian and his interrogation. I want to end this talk in the arms of Lady Astor, the first woman to sit in the House of Commons. She was a Conservative, of course. Dear Nancy, it's no great secret that Nancy Astor and Winston didn't really get on. They fought like ferrets in a sack their entire career. She once turned to him and said, "Winston, if you were my husband, I would poison your coffee." He turned to her and said, "Madam, if you were my wife, I would drink it." But there was a time that they were going side by side into the Guildhall in the City of London together. And she said, "Winston, look around you. You could fill half of this great hall with all the brandy that you've drunk in your life." The old man looked around him and said, "Just half?" he said. "There's so much more still to do and so little time to do it." That's good advice. My friends, we are facing what is nothing less than a march with destiny, a fight for the future of our country, a fight to reaffirm the simple idea that in the end it's the people who decide. And that's why we must carry on fighting to deliver the Brexit they voted for. Yes, yes, there is so much more still to do, so little time to do it. So, thank you. Thank you for what you have done already, and thank you for what I know you will be doing so willingly in the days ahead. And thank you for listening. May your dreams go with you.
Now, do you realise, Michael, you're responsible for spreading fake news in what you said there?
Oh, I do hope so. I really want to.
It wasn't Jacques Chirac who said that about Margaret Thatcher, about the eyes of Caligula and the mouth of Marilyn Monroe. It was President Mitterrand.
Of course, of course.
Had to catch you out on something. Now, let's talk a little bit.
I had Chirac in my mind, of course, because he parted.
He did indeed.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about your book writing, because you haven't written a book for some time now, and your fans are eager for another one. And you dropped a little hint there that the next one might feature Winston Churchill, because you wrote this wonderful series of what I call faction, where you mixed fact and fiction, which for the reader was quite difficult to discern which was which.
I often can't, as you know, can't tell often which is which. But the reason I haven't written a book is because I've been busy in the House of Lords, and you know, Parliament gets very distracting. A wonderful place, that gingerbread palace on the river. It's a place of lots of hard work, but also, may I say, trials and executions and assassinations, and even the execution of Guy Fawkes. You know Guy Fawkes, the only man, it is said, ever to enter the Parliament building with an honest intent. But I've been working, it has got distracting. I keep telling my wife, look, next year I'm going to spend more time doing what I really love, which is writing. That's what I want to have on my gravestone. Not that I was a political hack, but that I was a writing hack. But for some reason, we get Brexit and we get elections and it goes on and on and on.
But have you decided what kind of book you're going to write?
Yeah, I'm writing about 3 or 4, 5 different television scripts at the moment.
Okay.
So not so much books, but television scripts. Some based on Winston. I'd love to write a play about Winston Churchill, because I think that he speaks across the years so wonderfully well. Do you remember that wonderful wonderful film Darkest Hour that Gary Oldman of all people, played a fantastic Winston Churchill. And it just shows how nowadays, with all the modern technology and the new techniques we have, how we can really get a creative message home.
Do you enjoy the TV side just as much as writing novels? Because obviously the original House of Cards was turned into a TV drama, then followed by two of your other books. And now, of course, there's a huge success of House of Cards in the United States. Do you get a kick out of that? Or is it, obviously you get a lot of money out of it?
I've got 4 kids, what do you want? No, it's a very, writing books is very different from writing television and film. Writing a book, you traditionally, you lock yourself away in your attic and you spend hour after hour, day after day, remorselessly producing the script. It's very hard, it's very physically and emotionally draining, and it's very isolating. Some people say being a writer of books is a very lonely job. I don't find it lonely because you're there with your characters. But it is isolating, and in all honesty, I do find I'm a different person because I'm under such pressure in a different world. Television work is very much simpler. It's very much more collaborative. You lose control, of course, because it is part of a team effort, and other people are going to have to tell you and advise you what it is you're going to do. But actually, I love the back and forth of it all.
But it must have been quite difficult when the Americans were writing. Well, I say they were writing the script. I don't know what input you had in that. But you must have felt that you had lost control of the characters because they were creating completely different characters, okay, based on your original. But was that a frustrating process?
No, it's like watching your children grow up. You can't control the process. It happens, but you sit back and look at it with a sense of awe, almost. And after all, I can't be too precious about it because, I mean, I stole it from others, the whole idea. I remember as a kid at the age of, I think it was about 13, I was approaching O-levels, as we used to have in those days, and the teacher threw at me Shakespeare. I thought, oh, goodness, Shakespeare. Julius Caesar. And I started reading, and it was this fabulous story about the most powerful man in the world who got hacked and chopped and stabbed to death on the steps of his own Capitol building by his best mates, who then went off and killed each other. And as a 13-year-old, I thought this was fabulous. And I think that's probably what inspired most of House of Cards.
If you were writing a modern-day House of Cards, bear in mind it was, 1990 when it came out initially, who do you think in modern-day politics is most like Francis Urquhart?
Oh.
I have my own views on that.
We shall see. Now, it depends which part of Francis Urquhart, because remember Francis Urquhart came to a sticky end, and a deserved sticky end. I would, well, politics isn't quite what it used to be. I would hope that there's a bit of Francis Urquhart in all good Tories, because actually politics is a politics is a rough, tough business. It's not a nice, gentle, cuddly business. It's where you're fighting with passion for what it is you believe in. So don't give me this idea that everybody should conciliate and compromise. No, you stand and fight for what you believe in, politely but persistently. And so I hope that, like Renzi, I hope they don't take House of Cards as a book of instruction. But what really matters in politics to me is that politicians believe in something. And if I can offer one criticism about Francis Urquhart, it seems to me that he believed in nothing but power. And that's never enough. Because what are you going to leave behind you when your political career comes to an end? Power is meaningless unless you use it for a purpose.
To introduce a note of controversy, that is what people accuse Boris Johnson of, that he only ever wanted to be Prime Minister, used Brexit as a means to get there, and doesn't really believe in anything.
Boris, my dear, is delivering Brexit in a way that nobody else has even tried. And that is why I am full of optimism, because his resilience and his eloquence will get us through. And that is why they're trying so hard to shout him down, to destroy him, because they know that he threatens everything they stand for, which is yesterday. It's that old liberal media establishment where they tell us what it is we should be doing. That's why they're so happy with Brussels. And I don't want to say too unpleasant things about Brussels, simply to say that we have a right to decide to do things differently. That's what the people decided, and that is what Boris will deliver.
Do you think that people of our generation suffer from a bit of sort of old Gittism, where we think, well, of course, the politicians today, they're not like they were in the 1980s. Whereas I have a theory that the politicians, the public of the 1980s said, well, of course, they're not like the politicians of the 1960s. And this is very sort of a circular thing. Or do you actually look at politicians now and think, well, generally, they don't really believe anything, and they're the least impressive bunch of politicians that I've ever seen?
No, I don't quite accept that. I mean, politics has always been difficult, and it's always been impolite. I mean, I don't quite remember Hogarth, but I've seen his etchings of what politics used to be like. Somebody, 100 years ago, even threw a copy of a book across the chamber at Winston Churchill.
Wasn't John McDonnell, was it?
No. But one of the things that has changed today, it seems to me, is the difficulty that politicians have in stepping back from affairs in order to think about them, in order to put them in perspective. We now have 24-hour news, social media, and constantly their nose is held at the grindstone. I don't think that's particularly healthy. I don't happen to think that there is much of social media that is particularly healthy. I think that's a real concern for the next 10, 15 years. How do we take all the wonderful bits of social media and use them and exploit them without suffering from the really difficult parts of social media that are beginning to emerge? For instance, you know, the last 10, 15 years, the use of social media amongst young children, people has gone up like that. And the incidence of self-harm amongst young people has gone up like that. And the incidence of suicide amongst young people has gone up like that. I cannot but believe there is some connection, and we need to understand it, and we need to use social media, not social media use us.
I'm trying to imagine Harold Macmillan in an age of social media, where he, as Prime Minister, used to spend the afternoon reading a bit of Trollope.
And that wasn't because he was being idle or lazy, or because his wife was off with Bob Boothby. It was because he found that his means of getting reflection on the events of the day.
But modern-day Prime Ministers don't have that luxury, do they?
That's a problem. That is a problem. It's something...
Donald Trump has executive time. Apparently Donald Trump has 2 meetings a day, and that's it. And the rest of the time, he has executive time where he just spends his time doing what he wants.
What it seems to me about Boris is that Boris, when he was Mayor of London, and a hugely successful Mayor of London, got around him a team of excellent people, not all of them Conservatives, but mostly Conservatives, of course, and then trusted them to get on with the job that he had given them. He gave them the instructions, they went and did it. And I see the cabinet right now as being very much in that same mould, as being a group of very capable people who I think Boris will trust to get on with that job while he does the strategy, the big stuff, gets Brexit through. And I think there's a very healthy balance.
Right, let's go to some questions on the app. You can still submit questions if you'd like to. They'll immediately come up on my screen here. The most popular one so far: how would Frank Underwood approach Brexit?
Oh dear, how would Frank Underwood approach Brexit? He's rather fortunate, of course, because he can't simply call an election. Look, history's going to say one of the big problems about Brexit is that we called an election in 2000, the last election, at the very wrong time. And we got it wrong. Now, that is something that Frank Underwood could not do. What he would do is he would gather around us. I'm making this up as I go along, but then as a writer, I'm allowed to, aren't I? I think that what he would do is he would make sure that people understood where he stood and put as much pressure on those who opposed him to be honest about what it is they really wanted. And it's quite clear that there are many genuine Remainers who have issues with the way that we are pursuing Brexit. But there are many people on the Remain side who simply don't want Brexit at all and are trying to stop it. There is no doubt about that. And I think that we have to expose that time and again. And it is ironic, isn't it, that those who keep shouting, order, order, just leave behind them chaos, chaos.
So you don't think there would have been a scene where Frank Underwood pushes Michel Barnier off a train platform at all in front of a train?
I think President Juncker might end up just simply falling onto the tracks himself.
If you're watching, Mr. Juncker.
Has trouble with his back, yes.
Which one should we go to next? How do you do your research, someone wants to know? Is this the sort of thing where you, when you write I suppose the Winston Churchill trilogy, you had to do a lot of research, but whereas parliamentary ones, I suppose you can do it from instinct or experience.
Why do I write novels about Winston Churchill? What do novels have to do with anything? Well, actually, I think they have quite a lot to do with things because novels can fill in the gaps that history inevitably leads. Winston himself said history had a flickering lamp which stumbled along the pathways of the past. He knew that even his own histories weren't perfect. And what I like to do is to get inside the character. I wanted to get inside the character of Winston Churchill and then look at what it is he did. Work from the inside out rather than from the outside in, which is what most historians do. And for that, you know, I talked to many people who had worked for him. They were still alive then. I've been doing this for quite some time. Many of his staff, really personal staff, his nurses, his secretaries and so forth, after the war, they published little memoirs of their own. Actually, it was to build them a little pension pot, and Winston was quite happy with that. But they offered really personal insights into the man. And I like to think that I want to understand Winston Churchill not as that 65-year-old man out on a public stage with a cigar and a glass of whiskey. I want to imagine him sitting here at the end of a day and listen to what has mattered to him most. And that has come through the memoirs, as I say, of nurses, of private secretaries, and so forth. I once asked one of his private secretaries, I said, what was he really like? And she said, oh, he was wonderful. He was so wonderful. And I said, no, what was he really like? Oh, she said, well, actually, if you must know, he had a huge ego. He was occasionally a little arrogant. He was always incredibly impatient and sometimes bloody rude. But we loved him.
Do your characters sometimes, Anne Widdecombe said to me once that some of her characters in her novels often take her by surprise. But whereas other people who write novels, they've got the characters sketched out and they've got a definite plan and they know exactly what's going to happen to those characters. Which camp are you in?
I love the way that my characters suddenly grow. It is like watching, it is like watching your children because they do their own things. Look, I write thrillers, by and large, so thrillers require you to have a clear and quite powerful ending to the novel. So you've got to know where you want to get to. But I have very little idea anymore how I'm going to get there. I know that I'm starting from A and I've got to get to B eventually, but how I do that is often in the lap of the winds and imagination. But that is what makes it so exciting for you as a writer. You're living it too. And that's what makes you do this ridiculous job. It's not a proper job. It's not a proper job at all.
Try doing mine.
Yeah. Well, they say that, I keep saying I've never had a proper job. I once used to write advertisements for a living. I then went to writing political manifestos. But then I decided to change completely, and I just write works of fiction.
Well, I've been told that if we don't get off this stage by 11:25, we're going to be physically ejected. So I'm afraid we have to call it quits. So, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Dobbs.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Conservative Party Chairman, James Cleverly.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the auditorium. I hope you're having a fantastic conference. Thank you to everyone that's seen me and passed on their best wishes about the conference. I've passed that on to the team that helped make it happen. But today, this isn't about the conference. This is about our activists, our people, the ones who are making a real difference in the community. So, ladies and gentlemen, today I am going to be interviewing the people who actually make a real difference as Conservatives on the ground. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce them briefly now, and then also give them an opportunity to talk through what they do. We have Barry Ginley, Rena Ranger, Sean Anstey, Nicola Richards, and I'm going to invite to speak now the first Conservative leader, Bolton Council, in 40 years, David Greenhouse. Thank you.
Thank you, Conference. It is indeed, James, an honour and a privilege to be standing here on the main platform, as James has said at Conference, as the first Conservative leader of Bolton Council in almost 40 years. It isn't always easy being a Conservative up here. Over the years, we've certainly practised doing disappointment. We're up against it, a pretty organised and well-organised, oiled Labour machine. But I must pay credit to our associations and volunteers, party members in action, who, although relatively small in number, have campaigned tirelessly. We've targeted fiercely and chosen candidates wisely. And I have to pay tribute to my group of 20, 11 men, 9 women, who have stepped up to the plate and are delivering real change in Bolton, and more importantly, for the communities they represent. Bolton is made up of 7 parties, with Labour still, but hopefully not for very much longer, the largest party at 23, Conservatives 20, and then 17 other councillors from the remaining 5 parties made up from Liberal Democrats, UKIP, Brexit Party and 2 hyper-local independent parties, all of whom were not quite ready to enter into coalition with us, but they were willing to support a Conservative-led administration and, more importantly, a Conservative budget. At the last local elections, the residents of Bolton voted for change. It's our responsibility to deliver. In our first 100 days, we've set out a clear direction of travel, an extra £10 million to resurface Bolton's worst roads, already processed and approved. Between 150 and 200 of the town's worst roads and pavements resurfaced, the first being done this month, and the next remainder over the next 18 months. A £1.5 million investment to the Cleaner Greener agenda, investing in our parks and children's play areas, purchasing more effective and efficient cleansing and grass-cutting equipment, stronger enforcement on fly tipping, planting more trees and wildflowers, and cleaning up the borough. Decision processed and being actioned. We reversed Labour's proposed increase in councillors' allowances and did away with political assistance, where there was only one, and it was Labour's. And we led and made decisions and make them more open and more transparently. Too many decisions were made previously behind closed doors. We are investing in our community groups, depoliticising the awards of grant funding in our community sector, taking that out of the hands of politicians and giving it to our local CVS. So much under Labour was what you know, but who you knew. We are strengthening our contractors' framework, supporting local businesses, increasing social value and keeping the pound in the local economy. And Bolton is open for business. The vision of our ambition £1.2 billion master plan is to rebuild our town centre with the private sector's help and investment. 2,000 new homes being built, 7,500 jobs being created, £412 million coming into the local economy. And we're not just talking about it, we're making it happen. Bolton is changing, ladies and gentlemen. As Conservatives, we are more representative than we have ever been, with more younger candidates, more women candidates, and more ethnic minority candidates standing for us than ever before, and reducing Labour majorities by 4 figures. We will continue to deliver that change, and we are proud that we are doing it in the great town that needs it so desperately and that we all so desperately love. Thank you very much indeed.
David, thank you. Thank you very much. And the next person I'd like to invite up to the podium is Nicola Richards. Nicola is a councillor in Dudley, part of Andy Street's team, and the Midlands manager for the Jewish Leadership Council.
Hello, conference. My name is Nicola Richards. I'm a Conservative councillor in Dudley, and I was elected when I was 20 years old. I'm now into my 2nd term of office, securing the biggest majority in the borough this year. I stood for election in 2014, the first time, at the age of 19, and came 3rd after a hard fight with UKIP and Labour. This year, I ran a campaign that gained this seat finally, electing my friend and colleague, Sue, who, without Sue, we wouldn't have control of Dudley Council. And we're now back in improving local services for local people. I feel so lucky to have been encouraged by so many locally who, for some reason, when I was 16 years old, doing work experience with my local MP, saw some kind of potential and thought that I might make a good councillor. Without these people, and without the Conservative Party, I would not be where I am today. 9 years ago, I was too nervous to knock on a door, and now you just can't stop me. It blows my mind sometimes that a young girl from the Black Country has been given such opportunities. I used to get asked, why are you a Conservative? Why would a young person be a Conservative? And I just don't see any reason why I wouldn't be. Growing up in a normal working class family who succeeded by working hard, it meant I was the first in my family to go to university. We're a family of natural Conservatives and the West Midlands is full of them. I have the great pleasure of working with Andy Street at the moment, our fantastic Mayor of the West Midlands, a natural leader of the region that is home to industry, a man that understands business and the importance of investing in infrastructure. We know the Labour Party have let the West Midlands down for far too long. They've taken us for granted, but we're going to keep showing them that those days are well and truly over. We're not just the party of opportunity, we're inclusive. The work I've done within the Jewish community has been truly eye-opening. I've seen and heard firsthand how bad it feels for them at the moment. I am more than ashamed. It hurts me to the core that anti-Semitism is still a blight on our society. My friends in the community look on in despair at what is happening. And we're always learning as a party and striving to do the right thing. And I'm proud that the Conservative Party, my party, takes the issue of anti-Semitism and all racism seriously. It's incumbent on all of us, whatever faith, background, political party, whatever, to speak up and stand up against this. There are some things that do not have shades, that do not have nuances. They are simply wrong. So what does the party mean to me? It means it's the party of opportunity, doing the right thing, making people's lives better, giving people, young people, the best start in life, building more houses, investing in education. We're the party that doesn't ignore the will of the people, and I know we're the party that will carry out the will of the majority in Dudley that voted to leave the EU. And for me, it's the party that gave a 16-year-old girl from the Black Country a chance to represent the community.
So the next up to the podium, I'd like to invite Councillor Sean Anstey, who is the former leader of Trafford Council, became a leader at the age of 26. Sean.
Well, James, conference, thank you very much. And I think David was referring before in his opening remarks that sometimes it's quite tough up here. And I think we know that too well in Trafford, that it is quite tough sometimes for us, and politics doesn't always go your way. But the reason why I wanted to still take the opportunity, I think, to reflect and to speak to conference today is this. 17 years ago, when I was joining the Conservative Party, it was because I'd seen a Labour member who'd come round to my house in Partington, and they'd said, "Look, Sean, we're building this new health centre for you. Aren't we fantastic? We're a great Labour Party, we're doing this for you." And I said, but it's the same people going into this health centre, and it's the same doctors that work in it. So this idea that you can just throw money at something and make it better, I think is wrong. And that sparked my interest to join the Tory party, and it sparked my interest to say that politics should be used for the force for good that it can be, which is to actually take decisions for the people of the places that we seek to serve. And that's what we did in Trafford. Very proud of a Conservative administration in Trafford from 2004, an administration that in a northern metropolitan authority delivered some of the joint highest performing children's services in the country, the highest recycling rates of any metropolitan authority, the lowest council tax in the northwest, a new university institution, the Metrolink line out to the Trafford Centre, and of course played our part in the devolution of powers and funding to Greater Manchester. And when that change happened 18 months ago, and the administration became a Labour administration, they have worked tirelessly to treble pay on senior managers in Trafford. They've reversed a voluntary reduction in members' allowances just for Labour members. We've seen our children's services fall into inadequate. You see missed bin collections increasing. It takes some skill to do that in 18 months, but that, my friends, is what the Labour Party does when it takes power. But it puts across to you on a regular basis that they're moralising the righteousness that comes across from them, that they're right, and they're not. And that's why all of us, regardless of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, dedicate ourselves to the party, campaign for it, because we know that when the Conservative Party wins, and we will win Trafford back again in future, we can do so much better for our people and places. Thank you very much.
Sean, thank you. Thank you so very much. The next person who will be joining us up on stage, Councillor Rena Ranger from Three Rivers Council, passionate campaigner and champion for more diversity and more women in the party. Rena.
Good morning. Thank you. About 15 years ago, I was invited to a dinner to support an energetic, vibrant young mother who wanted to run for Parliament. She was an accidental politician and had been elected as a councillor after being encouraged to do so following a successful community action project that she was involved in. I listened to her story in awe as to what she had achieved and what she was embarking on. She was making a positive difference in her community. 8 years later, somebody asked me to help with some community action, and all the reasons and excuses I would have had to say no, my lack of political experience, my young children, they melted away, remembering that earlier dinner and that lady's story. She unwittingly became my role model. She resonated with me, and seeing how she had navigated her path, I saw I could navigate a similar one. Inspired by the power of role models, I went on to create a social initiative called Women Empowered, which always has men involved. And for the last 7 years, we have brought stories and experiences for others to be inspired by, to do whatever that special thing is that makes a difference to their life as they see it. And one of our success stories is me. I was asked by my local branch to stand as a candidate in the local elections. And in all honesty, I don't think I'd met that many councillors before, and my understanding of the depth and breadth of services that local councillors were responsible for was very limited. Councillors don't get the same exposures as members of Parliament, and for the most part, council is a background kind of thought in people's political minds. You pay your council tax, the bins get collected, and some people feel the same anxiety applying for planning permission as they did when they faced their school exams. But again, inspired by that same lady's story, I said yes. And 5 years ago, I was elected to Three Rivers District Council, and being a councillor is a privilege and it's a role that I love. I love being an active member of our community, getting to know people and advocating for our ward and our residents. Life in opposition isn't always easy and can be frustrating, but there's a lot of good that you can do, and the difference that you make to somebody's life, big or small, gives you a sense of unparalleled pride. It took me some time to convince my branch members that some of the changes I wanted to make in how we connect with our residents wasn't dangerous or nefarious. I simply wanted to email them. We knock on doors regularly, and we ask our residents if we can keep in touch via email about the important things: bin collection after Christmas, roads that will be closed for repair. And we have had over 1,000 email addresses collected for an electorate of just over 4,500. We can communicate quickly, our messages read at leisure, and many of our ward residents now who know who their local councillors are with far more recognition. It's made me and my fellow ward councillors minor celebrities at the local supermarket. It's my 6th year as a councillor, and there have been many times when I've knocked on the door and a parent has brought their young daughter out to come and meet me. And I always tell them the same thing. You can be a doctor, a teacher, a singer. You can work with elephants and be a local councillor. And I hope that one day, unwittingly, maybe I'll be remembered when one of those little girls, many years later, is asked to, or I hope proactively gets involved with their local communities and maybe its governance too. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Next up on stage, I'm going to invite Barry Ginley. Barry is a long-standing activist in local government in Kent, and he's also the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Disability Group. Thank you, Barry.
Good morning, conference. I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the Conservative Disability Group to thank the party for giving us the opportunity to present today. I think it's one of the first times that we've ever had the main stage, so thank you for that. I've been a member of the party for many years, and 10 years ago I thought it's about time I used my experience of my own disability and to try and help the party to become more inclusive for disabled people as activists, as candidates, and as MPs, and we even have some disabled members of the Lords as well. So disabled people throughout our whole party being active and ensuring that our perspective of life is considered at all stages of our party's development. I've been totally blind for 25 years now, and that, although a shock, didn't mean that I had to give up my goals and ambitions. And getting involved with politics was one of those ambitions. Long before I lost my sight, I thought it'd be nice to be a member of Parliament, and I'd like to be helping the Conservative Party, make life better for everybody, not just disabled people. But my experiences as somebody who's disabled helps bring a different perspective on our policies and our practices, and that's what we in the CDG try to aim, to be a critical friend for our party, try and guide on how policy can benefit the 13.9 million disabled people in the UK. That number's only going to grow because our population is getting older. So it becomes more and more important that all of our services, all of our policies and practices become more inclusive. So people such as myself, and I'm sure many in the audience, can continue to live their lives when they may acquire disability as getting older. We should never be forgotten, you know, and please, when you go back to your councils or your constituencies, urge any disabled candidates and activists to step forward and show the population and the country that this party is more inclusive than any other political party. Thank you very much.
Barry, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you to everybody. Now, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you will have been utilising the app. I can see a number of questions coming through. Remember, you can input a question of your own using the app. If there's a question that's already been asked that you think deserves to be answered, you can vote it up on the app. So we're going to go initially to the most popular question on the app at the moment, and a number of you have touched upon this already. But I'm going to start with you. David. How did you first get involved in the Conservative Party, and did a particular person ask you to join?
I'm afraid it's a bit boring. You're going to regret this. I mean, I actually grew up in a reasonably conservative household, so it's probably not the... I've not got a great backstory with this, I'm afraid, but I was suddenly approached and inspired. I probably came into it a roundabout way in that I just really fell in love with the whole campaigning aspect of it to start with. So I went, I simply grew up in a household that was very heavily involved in conservatism. So, and from that got inspired, obviously, went away to university, came back, started a career, but then came back and decided to get back involved in the community and revisit and start representing. Because I think that's probably the heart of everything, and that's where we tend to go. So I think the community involvement is key to all this. And if we persuade people through our community, our commitment to communities, people will start to listen to us more closely and pay attention to us as they start to see the work we're doing.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, just to prove that this is live and interactive, we have a question which has been asked in direct response to Rena's speech, and it is, and I'll read the question verbatim, we never found out who Rena's role model was. Who was it? I need to know! Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark.
She was a local councillor in Amersham, and she still is, and she was the first BME, I think, chairman of Amersham Council, or mayor, I don't know what they exactly call it, but it was a lady called Mimi Harker.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, there you go. And look, you know, if you see someone that you think should be involved in politics, reach out, bring them on board. Barry, who was it that inspired you? Was it a particular person, a particular event? What made you want to get involved in politics?
Okay, my real inspiration and the person that really impacted me, I remember in May 1979, waking up one morning as an 11-year-old boy and seeing our first female Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. And the reason why she had such an influence, my dad's was a long-distance lorry driver, and he was forever being taken out on strike by the unions. And as we only had his income coming into the house, you know, it meant that we had to go short on many things. Mrs. T came in and sort of put the great back into Britain, and so therefore, you know, she was my real inspiration. And it was unusual because we were a Labour voting household at the time, but we're all now good Conservatives.
Ah, outstanding, outstanding. Another, right, this question is becoming very popular. I'm going to come to Sean initially on this. What has made the biggest difference in your campaigning?
I mean, I think we had a scenario, and we're working back to this, I think, of when we had clear messaging, good decisions, and regular communication. I mean, you really can't say much more than that. And, you know, like I said in my reflections, clearly sometimes that works particularly better for us, sometimes it doesn't. But what you're fighting for and that passion and those values. So we had some fantastic candidates, some great activists who came out for us, and that trying to create some fun in campaigning, frankly. I mean, nobody wants to particularly go out on a Saturday morning and shove literature through people's letterboxes, but you have to do it because it furthers the values and causes that we all believe in. And so just holding true to those values, making sure you do it consistently, we found was certainly a more engaging way of getting people involved with us.
Yeah, fantastic. So Nicola, you've been involved in the fantastically successful campaign to get Andy elected as our Conservative Mayor for the West Mid. So yeah, what's made the biggest difference for you in terms of campaign? What do you like about it?
I think really he can in some ways make it quite easy for us because he's doing so many good things. He's so likeable. He's not a typical politician, you know, he's a businessman. He understands how business works. He understands the economy in the West Midlands and how important it is for every single person that lives there. And so, you know, and also he's very likeable. Anyone that meets him loves him. So it's about, you know, getting the message out about what he's doing for that area. He's doing something for everybody. He's going to make a good impact on every person's life in the West Midlands, and we've just got to carry on telling people about it.
Brilliant, fantastic, fantastic. Oh, here we go. We've got a runaway winner at the moment. Those of you, you've been voting. Of course, the thing is, you know what the questions are going to be, but the panel don't. Barry, it's one for you again. This is going to be a tough, difficult, probing question. What's the name of the dog?
I must have ESP because I thought that was coming. She's called Skye, and she's named after the Isle of Skye, not the broadcaster. Sorry, Sky Broadcasting.
Okay, another popular one. Going to put me under a bit of pressure, David, and I'll come to you first on this. What more do you want to see from CCHQ?
Oh my goodness me.
Okay, good answer.
I want them to listen to the Voluntary Party a little bit more, and I think you already do, but I think I think it's a little bit like turning around an ocean liner. I've compared that to us in Bolton as well when we took over from Labour. But I think it is. I think there's a bit of a perception out there as well that you're fighting against, and I think all the, without flanneling you too much, all the noises I'm hearing are that you're out there and you are listening to people. But I think, there are so many unsung heroes in this party that literally, whether it's stuffing envelopes, delivering leaflets, just work tirelessly for the party. And I think, they're just a little bit, I think, more of recognition of those people. I also think, I'm a great one for, I said before in my speech, picking the right candidates for the right areas. And I think, if there's one message that I could give to you, putting on the national thing, I think, we've some great local candidates out there as well, and I think, start to give them a bit of a chance somewhere.
Okay, I think that's useful feedback, genuine feedback. And look, please, ladies and gentlemen, if there are ideas that you've got for what we can do at CCHQ to make it better, please get in touch. chairman@conservatives.com. Send me emails about how you think we can improve. A very, very, I think popular is the wrong word for this, a really important issue. And Nicola, I want to come to you initially with this one. How do you deal with toxicity and personal attacks in campaigning at the local level? And I think, Nicola, and then Rena, I'm going to ask you that one as well, because I know that it can be really hard for women in politics.
It can be very difficult, and I've been mainly lucky with the experience I've had on the doorstep. The ones that I was really annoyed, one woman opened the door and said, you're 20 years old and you think you can be my councillor. My daughter's 20 and she can't do it. And I was like, but I'm not your daughter. And sometimes it can really, I've only had very few very bad examples where you'll have someone slam the door and shout at you. It's more online where it's a problem, and because I like to consider myself an advocate for the Jewish community, that then multiplies it. I don't know whether they think I'm Jewish, I'm not. I can get anti-Semitic abuse, even though I'm not Jewish. That slant thing is really hard. I watched Question Time in Dudley a few months ago. From the balcony as a councillor, wasn't involved in the show, took a selfie up there before the show started, and the amount of abuse I got for months was ridiculous. And I think it's the left that they don't like. There's a young female from Dudley. There's lots of us. There's lots of Conservatives around. They hate it.
Oh, okay.
We've got to carry on.
Thank you. Rena, what's your experience been?
It can be hard, and like you will have some people who are very not nice to you at the doorstep, and you can get chased out of a driveway at some times, and then people will accuse you of stuff or question your values. But I think we have conviction in what we stand for, and we know that the things that we are doing in our communities, or the values that the Conservative Party have, are genuinely values that many of us hold, whether it's education and all the rest of it. And it is about having those conversations calmly on the doorstep and articulating our message to try and get through some of that noise, to say this is what we stand for and this is what we believe and this is why we're doing X, Y, and Z. But it is unfortunate. I think you do have to be a bit thick-skinned about things and realise that some of those voices, some of that noise, there may not be people who you just have to let it go, because the good you do just drowns some of that out.
Yeah.
It's a sad reality, but...
Yeah, it is. Sean, I'm going to come to you next, and there are a couple of questions which I'm going to kind of just squish together because they're quite similar. You were a council leader at the age of 26. I can't even remember being 26. It's that far away now. So how do we go about inspiring more young people into particularly representative politics? What advice would you give them to that?
Well, I mean, I think first of all we need to keep on doing what we do, which is to broaden our appeal, to get people have conviction. That's really important. It's that point about abuse and belief. Generally, if somebody's not happy with you, you're doing something right. So you just need to keep on trying to sort of work through that. And I was very fortunate in Trafford that when my predecessor stood down, I'd been his deputy for a few years. I'd been cabinet member for finance. And they'd, in fact, when I was selected to stand in Bolton at 1920, was nearly 11 years ago, they took a risk, really. They took a punt on a young person who'd come from a family that wasn't involved in politics, and they tried to do it. And the party locally needs to do more of that. And answer the question about what CCHQ needs to do, it needs to encourage more of that to happen. And then we just need to support young members through that period, because it's right, it's been mentioned already. You learn things that you never thought you'd had to learn before, like how a council works and the resilience that you need to be able to do this. If you get that right, there's no reason why we won't get more people involved.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, absolutely. Actually, Sean, I'm going to stick with you for another question, just for a moment, which is about what tips you would give to help get better levels of Conservative representation in other northern towns and cities? Well,
I tried to win the Greater Manchester mayoralty a few years ago and had the fortune of standing against Andy Burnham. But, we polled 128,000 votes in that election. And, that's 128,000 votes for people where we said, do you know what, this might be a city or a city region where, the Labour Party have some of their heavyweight dominant seats. But we're just not going to take that line down. We're going to go out and say that, for the reasons that I said in my remarks, this is where I think the Labour Party are wrong, this is where I think the opposition parties are wrong, here's where I think we're right. And there's places now like Greater Manchester that are benefiting from Conservative policies, Conservative local government in Bolton, and we need to keep on doing that, sharing that message, because it's blindingly obvious to me, and I'm a fairly nuanced sort of person, but when we do get it right, there's no reason why there's not a part of this country that shouldn't feel they're able to vote Conservative. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And David, I have to come to you as well on this. What more can we do to continue our success in the north?
I think the interesting thing that we have to acknowledge is that the tribalism is going. There isn't the inherent, whether that's because of Brexit or whatever, the party affiliation, that my grandfather, the number of times I've had said to me over the last couple of years in Bolton, my grandfather and father would be spinning in their graves if they knew I was voting Conservative, but they are doing. And yes, we have to look to the other end of the spectrum as well, in our more affluent areas, in a sense, where we might have a little bit more liberalism going on. But there's a definite change and we need to reach out to those people. That's the main thing. These are areas that predominantly we have maybe put to one side and said, oh, we're not doing so well there. We are doing well there now, and I would say to all associations, go into those areas, test the waters, and you'll be surprised. There should be no areas where you should, if you're in a strong Leave area, particularly in the north, the chances for for making real gains. And you know, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a period of years and elections. And if you can get the same candidate to work that seat over a period of time, a good local, get involved in that community, make a name for themselves, people are looking for someone that they can just admire in politics, and the community is the best way through to that. But people are out there, they're fair game at the moment, and we should be in those communities fighting to bring them back to us.
Fantastic, absolutely, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are nearly done. We are nearly done. I've got one more question. I'm going to ask this question to each of our panellists in turn. And I think really this is a great question for us to finish with. So the question is this, and I'll start with you, Barry, then work back towards this way. What makes you optimistic about the future for our party?
I'm optimistic because we are the party of Great Britain, and I think that people do relate to our values, and we just need to sort of get past our current climate and then sort of, you know, just really sort of push the Conservative message forward to everybody. There's a lot of Labour and Lib voters who are desperate to come and vote for us, so let's get them over to us.
Fantastic. Rena.
I'm optimistic because on this stage in just the last couple of days, you've heard so many policy announcements that will make a positive difference to people's lives, daily lives, and those messages need to get out. And I appreciate, you know, we need to get Brexit done so those messages can get out and people can really hear what the Conservative Party has in store for the future, and they are positive messages of what we can become and where we can go, and I think that those just need to be heard a little bit more.
Fantastic, fantastic. Sean?
Judges, I think a diversity of opinion in a unified party, that's what makes me optimistic about the future. And our people, all of us in this room, all of us who are elected, you know, we keep going. And that's what the Conservative Party's always done. I'm sure it's what we'll always do, will do. And keep going, we will win.
Fantastic. Nicola?
So I'm optimistic because I think in the West Midlands especially, we have a great team of MPs and councillors who all unite under Andy Street's leadership, and I'm positive that we're going to keep on winning in the West Midlands.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's...
Yeah.
David?
I'm optimistic locally because we're moving forward with a great agenda in Bolton with what people want for a sea change. I'm optimistic nationally because we finally have, I think, a Prime Minister and a government that are finally representing the people and doing what they want.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for engaging in this process. Thank you so very much for the questions that came in. There are a couple that unfortunately we couldn't fit in because of time, but I'm going to finish by answering the question that I asked the panellists. And the thing that makes me so incredibly optimistic about the future of the party are the kind of people who make our party work. People like Barry and Rena and Sean and Nicola and David, people like you. You are what makes me optimistic about the fantastic future that we have for our party and for our country. Thank you so very much. Thank you.